Welcome back, DPReview TV viewers. Chris Nichols here. Today we're looking at the brand new Panasonic S5. This is a pre-production camera, but it's very close to final. Is this camera for photographers or is this camera for videographers? The answer is yes. Now, to be totally fair, the L-mount Panasonic S system has been around now for a little while, but it hasn't made big splashes. And I think that's because they're either very niche products, ultra high resolution models or made for high-end video. Their only jack of all trades camera was the S1, but it was honestly bulky, heavy, and really priced itself too high for that market. So now we have a very affordable, very lightweight camera that is full frame and takes L-mount lenses. This could be very exciting. Now at the start we mentioned this camera is lightweight, and it absolutely is. We're clocking in at 714 grams, which is significant when you consider the Panasonic S1 weighs well over 1,000 grams. Now that's like 1/3 of a Noct versus half a Noct. That is 7 pounds of feathers versus 10 pounds of bricks. I mean, we're talking a huge difference, and you really do feel it when you're holding the camera. Now, even though the S5 is lightweight, that does not mean it's cheaply built. The dials feel fantastic here, really easy to turn. I like the on-off switch, easily manipulatable with one hand. The grip on here, not the worst grip I've held, way better than a Sony a7 III, for example. I know it's not saying much. My fingers do push in a little bit on the inside, but overall comfortable and secure. I like the autofocus control structure on the back, very similar to an S1H, works fantastic. Now, we are also told by Panasonic that the S5 is weather sealed and to basically the same standard as the GH5, which makes Jordan and I very happy because we have very much abused GH5s, had them out in full rain, and they've survived no problem. So that is reassuring. We also have dual card slot here, just SDs. We don't have CF Express, but that's perfectly fast for what this camera is capable of doing. One slot is UHS 2, but the other secondary slot is UHS 1. Now, that's not going to have any effect on any of the video features. That's a big plus. But if you are shooting RAW plus JPEG bursts, high speed, and a lot of them, you are, if you're running backup to both cards, going to have to deal with the slower card slot speed. So it's not detecting bees here, but I do have to say that the autofocus seems very accurate, going right where I want it to, very quick, very snappy. Now, being the most affordable camera in the lineup, there are some compromises. One of the major ones we see is in the displays. Now, first off, the back LCD panel is fine. It's fully articulating, which we love. Very fast touchscreen interface, $1.8 million dots. It's not bad. I mean, it's fine. The EVF, though, is a 2.36 million dot EVF. And, you got to consider, like, the Panasonic GH5 even has a higher res EVF than this camera. It does support 120 frame per second refresh rate. There's no RGB tearing or anything like that, but you do see the pixelation, and I think it's because, now we're sort of in a world where there's a lot of sub 4 million dot EVFs, which are great. There's a lot of sub 6 million dot EVFs from Panasonic, for example, and Sony is now pushing the 9 million dot barrier in the EVF. So you can't help but feel like this viewfinder is feeling a little bit dated, and you do notice it. I have to be honest with you. But let's keep this in context. If you look at Sony's closest competition to this, the a7 III, that's an old camera, but it's the same resolution EVF. Then we have brand new battery in this camera. It's a BLK22, very similar shape and size to the older GH5 batteries. Now, they do give you an external charger with the camera. It's charging very quickly, and this battery is actually quite impressive. We're getting a step up in battery life. SEPA ratings, 440 shots if we're using the LCD panel, 470 shots if we use the EVF. Now we're on the Peace Bridge here, but against all convention, we're not actually doing a walk and talk, we're doing a stable shot. But that's not to imply that this camera is not stable. In fact, it has the exact same IBIS system that we've seen in all the other Panasonic S bodies. 6.5 stops, very stable, nice to have in a camera like this price point, and I thought it would actually be missing from it. So if you want this camera for weddings or sports or wildlife, it's an adequate burst rate, but it's not great. And just to clarify, so first off, let's say we don't need continuous autofocus. Then we're getting 7 frames per second, not bad. But more importantly, we probably want continuous autofocus and tracking. Then we're down to 5 frames per second continuous, which is a little bit below what you'll often find at this price point. Now we're testing it here, and roughly speaking, if I shoot RAW plus JPEG, I'm gonna get 30 to just over 30 shots before the buffer fills. Again, not amazing, not terrible. It's kind of that fair to middling. Now let's say you do need a faster burst rate than that. Well, remember that Panasonic does have their 6K photo mode. We made a video which explains a lot of it in detail. You should check that out. It's JPEG only, 18 megapixels, electronic shutter mode. However, you can shoot up to 30 frames per second, and you do get some interesting options to pre-buffer your shot, make sure you don't miss that moment that you're trying to capture. Now the moment that you've all been waiting for, my friends. You have heard that the Panasonic S5 has some startling new autofocus improvements, and I definitely want to talk about this because it is a big change. Now, in the past, we have talked about the Panasonic cameras having an excellent hit rate, but a very unenjoyable photographic experience when you're focusing the camera, especially in continuous autofocus. Its single point autofocus has always been just dead quick, very precise, and we've enjoyed it. But with continuous autofocus, the Panasonic's DFD autofocusing system was always wobbling. Not only is your subject wobbling, but the background is going nuts. And it really does not inspire confidence when you're focusing to wonder, are these shots even in focus? Everything's wobbling, like what's happening? It was quite disconcerting. So Panasonic on the S5 have made some big changes, and they have drastically changed how this camera handles its DFD autofocus. Now, before we get to the test, I do want to point out we didn't do them through the Ninja recorder like we normally do through the HDMI port, because we actually found it does degrade the autofocus performance when you're shooting photos. Keep that in mind, not video. So we put an iPhone right up to the eyepiece, and we actually shot at 60 frames per second so we can slow it down and you can really see that wobble and just the magnitude of the difference there. So what we did is we shot a test against the S1H, which has the older Panasonic DFD system, so to speak, and now the new S5. And the first thing I want you to notice, when we look at just single point autofocus on Jordan, just standing still, moving ever so slightly, you will again notice that the background does wobble significantly with the S1H. Whereas on the S5, you'll notice that Jordan basically looks totally still, and the background, it is wobbling, but very slightly. It is so much nicer shooting experience. The next test we did was Jordan moving towards the camera, okay? Now we did try this again with just single point autofocus on him as he came closer. And actually, I've noticed on both cameras, when a subject is moving towards, it's not wobbling as bad, but when they stop, again, you can see that the S5 is far more stable. So then we thought we'd try is the eye detect, face detect, body detect mode, just to see if there's any difference there. And again, it's the same story. The S1H, you can see here, quite a bit of wobble in the samples. It is a very strange kind of feeling, and the S5 drastically reduced. So for photographers, it takes away the whole problem that we really complained with Panasonics, and that's the strange shooting experience. The hit rate is good. I was very happy with the shots that I got in focus of Jordan here. And honestly, between the S1H and the newer S5, I didn't notice that much difference. The hit rate on Panasonics is quite decent. What I did notice was that in the S5, I don't get annoyed by that constant wobble, and I have the confidence to know where the camera is focusing.
Hey everyone, it's Jordan to talk about the video functionality of the Panasonic S5. And looking at the spec sheet, this thing looks incredibly well spec'd, especially for the price. The real question is this a full frame GH5 or is it a baby S1H? Let's find out. So pay close attention to the image right now because we're shooting 10-bit 4K 24 frame per second internal, but we have autofocus continuous with face detect going on right now. And hopefully we're not seeing a huge amount of wobble like what we'd see with a lot of the other Panasonic cameras. So how does this camera stack up? Well, the most exciting thing about it, I think, is that we're getting internal 10-bit recording at 24, 30, and even 60 frames per second, although there is a Super 35 crop when you go 4K 60. We also get 1080 recording up to 180 frames per second. So let's talk about the wobbly elephant in the room, and that is Panasonic's Contrast Detect Video Autofocus. And I've been running a lot of tests with these for about a week now, and my main takeaway of it is it's really lost a lot of that aggressive, super jittery pulsing that could drive you absolutely crazy with the other Panasonics, but the overall accuracy isn't completely there, it's just a little bit unpredictable. Now, basically, the faster the sensor can scan, better your video autofocus is gonna be. So full frame, 24 frames per second, like we're recording right now, is actually the worst autofocus performance you're gonna get. When we were doing the bag video, I went to Super 35, 24 frames per second with Chris walking towards the camera, and it did a great job the majority of the time, although in one case it did completely lose focus, jump on the background, and then snap back over to him. And this is my real concern with the Panasonics. Most of the time, it's quite good. It is enormously improved over what we had before, but it's still quite unpredictable. Because this is strictly contrast based, I did find a few tricks to make it a little bit more responsive. First of all is to actually use faster shutter speeds. That gives it more contrast to work with. It can see the edges a little bit more clearly. So unfortunately you might get jittery motion, but you will get better autofocus performance with that. Secondly, faster your frame rate, better that focus performance is going to be. It's very good at 4K 60 frames per second, although again, you're in Super 35 mode with a crop there. Okay, so now we're gonna move myself and the camera a little bit, but we've switched it over to the Super 35 region, so the autofocus should be fairly good in this situation. And I wanna talk about overheating with this. It seems like it's on a lot of people's minds for some reason this year. I did run some overheating tests with this, and one of the first things you might see compared to the S1H is this camera does, in 10-bit, have a 30-minute record limit on it because it doesn't have that active cooling that we saw on the Panasonic S1H. So I stuck it out in the sun on top of a black trampoline, and at the end of the 30-minute clip, started it rolling again. The camera did overheat at 43 minutes. Now what sets this apart from the Canon R5 and R6 is I put it in the shade for 10 minutes. After that, started recording again, and I was able to record a full 30-minute 10-bit clip right after it. So this camera does get hot, but it also cools down very quickly. Let's talk slow motion. Everybody loves slow-mo. And it is quite a difference from the Panasonic S1H, even though looking at the specs, you might think they're capable of the exact same slow-mo recording. If you want to capture audio in your video, then you're capped at 60 frames per second. You can do 1080 60 or 4K 60 with that, and the quality is excellent. However, on the Panasonic S1H, you had the option to do 1080 120 recording with audio, which would be great for something like right here where I'm playing drums. Unfortunately, can't record audio, so I'm sure our friends at Beat Suite will give me something very dramatic that I can put underneath it. Now this will go all the way up to 180 frames per second, but it moves in very big steps. It goes 120 to 150 frames to 180 frames per second. And once you go past that 150 frame, puts a crop on the video, and the quality does degrade quite a bit, as you can see here. So very capable slow-mo machine. Unless you need to capture audio at the same time you're rolling, then it's quite restrictive. Now audio quality is just as important, if not more important, than your video quality. Panasonic knows that. That's why they've generally had very good audio controls in all their cameras, but they do all tend to share a trait of very hot audio. Now, this is something that they've tried to address with the S1H. That actually lets you go all the way down to minus 18 decibels when you're plugging a mic straight into the camera, unlike the rest of the Panasonic line, the S5 included, where it'll only go down to minus 12 decibels. So if you've got a fairly sensitive mic, like the Rode Wireless Go we're using right now, you might find even turned down all the way, you might sometimes see a little bit of clipping if you get excited and start loudly talking to the camera. Now, one thing I love, you can get around that with the XLR1 adapter that's available. It has a pad on it, lets you plug 2 XLR mics in it. It's small, it's light, it's beautiful, it's affordable. That's probably something that you're going to want to grab for professional audio quality. So there are a few downgrades from the S5 compared to the S1H. We talked about some already, like the lack of 1080 120, potential for overheating, and the inability to set your audio levels quite as low. But there's a few kind of minor annoyances as well, like the lack of a tally lamp on this, so I can't tell if I'm recording. Chris, I hope you're recording.
The fortune cookie says somewhat likely.
Okay, perfect. There's also a micro HDMI port instead of the full size, and I don't know about you, but I've broken many micro HDMI ports in the middle of a shoot. That could be a real problem. On top of that, the waveform takes up most of both your displays, the EVF and the LCD, and there's no option to resize them like on the S1H. But one thing I love about Panasonic is they seem to be trying to give Fujifilm a run for their money in terms of the manufacturer giving you awesome firmware updates on a regular basis. And before the end of the year, the S5 is going to get a whole bunch of S1H features. You know, I love shutter angles. We're getting shutter angles. We're getting cinema 4K recording. We're getting ProRes RAW added to this, although it is coming out of that kind of shitty little HDMI port. And we're getting vector scopes as well, and those are going to work when you're changing white balance. This is a huge firmware update, and it's coming before the end of the year. So for a lot of people, the question is going to be, well, should I save all this money and get the S5 or go for the S1H? Now, the S1H, I think, still has a very professional niche. I mean, you're getting things like all-eye recording, you're getting internal 6K with that, a full-size HDMI port, that dope tilt screen on the back of it, better EVF, a lot of functions. But for way less money, this does give you so much of that package. I love having a smaller, lighter camera if you're going to be using it on a gimbal. Battery life is still excellent on this. I think it's going to make a lot of people happy. And if you're one of the many GH5 shooters thinking, is this the right time for me to move up to full frame? I think this would be a brilliant upgrade for you. It's going to be very familiar, and you will see a very noticeable image quality bump. This is a hell of a video camera for the price, and unless you need really consistent autofocus, I would certainly take this over the A7 III or the Nikon Z6.
Now, I know we haven't talked much about image quality yet on the Panasonic S5, but that's because it's a known commodity. We have the exact same sensor and processor as you'll find in the Panasonic S1. And, you know, compared to things like the Nikon Z6, the Sony A7 III, we're talking very comparable low light capabilities and megapixel count. However, this does have an interesting feature compared to the competition. It has the high res mode, which quadruples your megapixel count. If you're seen as a still life and you've got a good tripod, for example, you can really get much higher resolution out of your images. Now, while we're on the topic of the Sony A7 III and the Nikon Z6, what advantages do those cameras have over this? When it comes to the A7 III, although it's an older camera, I do still feel like its continuous autofocus performance gives you an edge. But keep in mind, the A7 III doesn't have all the new fancy machine learning real-time autofocus tracking that the newer Sony bodies have, and that's where you get a really substantial upgrade. This camera comes very close. The Nikon Z6, beautifully handling body, and it does have nicer displays in it. But do keep in mind that the Panasonic S5 does normally come with an excellent 20-60 kit lens. Not only does it give you an incredibly wide angle, but it's also a very good price point. Now, while we're on the topic of comparing cameras to the S5, what about the more expensive S1? Is there any reason to still buy that camera? Well, a couple here. First off, big bombshell, the S1, the S1R, and the S1H are all going to get the exact same autofocus DFD improvements as the S5, which is huge, which means that that's going to be a level playing field in that regard. So really, it's going to come down to things like the fact that the S1 has a much faster frame per second burst rate and buffer speed. If you're shooting wildlife and sports, that might be a make or break for you. Second thing, it is a more overbuilt heavy body. Some people are going to like the way that that feels, the way it balances heavier lenses, and it does have an incredibly robust shutter actuation life. But otherwise, you know, video features, this camera actually in a lot of ways seems to surpass the S1 because we don't know if the S1 is going to get all of that ultra cool video improvement that we have here. Having anamorphic support, RAW support, this represents incredible value for the dollar, especially if you're looking for a fantastic hybrid photo and video outfit. You know, I really think that this is the camera that Panasonic needed right now. A more versatile, less niche camera at a very good price point. And keep in mind that there's actually now a lot of third-party, very affordable lenses for this L mount, which is going to open up the system more and more. As always, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much. Let us know what you think below in the comments. Please check out Instagram and Twitter. Go to DPReview.com and hit subscribe. Make sure that you check out some of the other videos like the 6K photo modes for this camera. Thanks so much for joining us. See you guys soon.